So we may end the testimony this afternoon a bit early because I'm going to need to meet with the lawyer to discuss the instructions that I'm going to give you when I give you the instructions on the law that you have to follow in deciding this case. So just to give you a little heads up, we're not going to go probably as late as we normally do this afternoon, but we are ready to proceed. State, call your next witness.
The state calls Emily Martin.
She'll take the witness stand over here and remain standing when you get there.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Counsel, you proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Could you introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Emily Martin.
And how were you employed in April of 2016?
I was employed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Jacksonville Regional Operations Center in the biology section.
And what did you do in the biology section at FDLE?
I was a DNA analyst.
Can you just briefly describe your education and training as it relates to that field?
I have a bachelor's of science in forensic science and a minor in chemistry that I earned from the University of Central Florida.
And did you have any specialized training either with FDLE or any other agency as it relates specifically to DNA testing?
Yes, I went through a 2-phase training program at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to become an analyst. So the first phase is primarily academic, with a heavy emphasis on reading journal articles and a lot of written and oral tests, just to make sure that we understand the science behind the testing that we're conducting. The second phase is called supervised casework, where I worked on actual cases that came into the laboratory under the supervision of my trainer. I had to complete a certain number of cases, and then at the end I had a competency test and a mock trial.
How long did you work for FDLE in that capacity?
From 2008 until 2017.
Can you approximate how many times over the course of your career you actually conducted DNA testing on items?
Thousands of times.
And have you testified before as an expert witness in the field of forensic DNA analysis?
Yes, I have, approximately 40 to 50 times.
So we're here to talk about DNA. Can you kind of give us an idea of what is DNA?
DNA is an acronym. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's basically the blueprint or the instructions for making you who you are. You inherit it directly, half from your mother and half from your father. It's found in every cell in your body except your red blood cells. And no two people have been found to have the same DNA profile except for identical twins.
Ms. Martin, in March and April of 2016, were you assigned to conduct DNA testing on a number of items of evidence from the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office in connection with an investigation into the murder of 2 victims by the name of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And did you conduct DNA testing on such items?
I did.
What type of DNA testing did you do?
The type of DNA testing that is performed at FDLE is called STR DNA testing. And STR stands for short tandem repeat. And all that means is the areas that we're looking at on the DNA molecule. They don't code for anything, meaning they don't say like what your hair color or your eye color is. They're basically just short segments of repeated letters on the DNA strand. So those are the areas that we're looking at. And the only way that they differ from individuals is the number of times they repeat at the certain areas.
Can you just kind of give us a brief step-by-step explanation as to how the testing works? What do you do with a particular piece of evidence to determine if in fact it has DNA on it?
So a brief synopsis would be, the first thing is just to kind of visually examine the item of evidence. We need to look at it to determine, is there even a stain on this item that we would DNA test? So in those instances, we can do what we call preliminary testing, where we just would test for blood, semen, or saliva, whichever is appropriate, to identify a stain that may have DNA. Once that's done, we take a cutting of the stain and perform an extraction on that stain. So we have to extract the stain off of whatever it's on, whether it's an item of clothing or a cotton swab, then we have to extract the DNA from the stain. The next step is called amplification, and we like to call this the genetic Xerox machine. So we're basically just taking the information that's there and making a bunch of copies of it so it's easy for our instrumentation to view the information. The last step is the analysis, where it goes into an instrument and it comes out in the forms of peaks on the graph. So then it would be my job to look at the peaks on the graph and determine what is the DNA profile, if any, and then compare that to the known standards that we have in the case from any victims or subjects or elimination standards.
Okay. You refer to known standards. What can you kind of explain that just a little bit?
A known standard is a sample of DNA that came from a known individual. So it can be either blood or saliva are the two normal forms that we give in. So either someone can have their blood drawn and it's noted, this blood is from this person, or a saliva swab from the inside of their mouth. This swab came from this person. So then we can conduct DNA testing on that item and say, okay, this is the DNA profile of this known individual, and compare that to any question statements that we have in the case.
Okay. And in terms of the testing on the known standard, it's basically the same thing that you do with the item of evidence with DNA that may have come from an unknown source.
The process is the same, except we don't have to do the preliminary stain identification, because we already know what the sample is and where it came from.
Once you determine that a DNA profile from a piece of evidence matches DNA from a particular person, what do you do?
So if there's a match between a known and a question stain, I would then calculate a statistic on the match. And so all that's doing is telling me how frequent or how rare is this DNA profile in the population.
Okay. And are you trained to calculate population statistics?
Yes.
Now, in this particular case, did you receive, we were talking a little bit about DNA standards, did you receive DNA standards identified as coming from two individuals, Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins, the victim in this case?
Yes, I did.
And what form was their DNA standard in?
Those were in the form of a DNA card or a blood stain card.
Did you also receive a DNA standard identified as coming from a James Colley?
Yes.
And what form was that DNA standard in?
That was a buccal swab or a cheek swab, like from the inside of your mouth.
Man, first witness, Your Honor.
You bet.
Ms. Martin was showing you what's been entered into evidence already as Exhibit 50. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And is that the DNA standard from James Colley that you analyzed in this case?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And you conducted DNA analysis on all of those standards that we just mentioned in this particular case, correct?
I did.
Were you able to develop a full DNA profile from each of the standards?
Yes.
Okay. When we talk about a full DNA profile, can you tell us what that meant?
So when I talked earlier about looking at certain areas on the DNA molecule, depending on what kind of amplification kit, the Xerox copy machine kit that we're using, it looks at a certain number of areas on the DNA profile. So when you run a DNA sample, you may not obtain information at all of the areas all the time. So when you say you obtain a full DNA profile, it just means that I obtained all the DNA information that I could possibly obtain from that sample.
Okay, and at this particular point in time when you conducted this testing, how many genetic markers were you testing for at that particular time?
15 actual DNA areas on the molecule, and then also the gender marker, which tells me if it's male or female.
Okay, and with regard to each of those markers, there would be 2 alleles at each marker, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and one of those alleles would be the one you get from your mother and one from your father, is that correct?
Yes, and an allele is just a number. When I talk about how the DNA profiles are different in the number of times it repeats at a certain area, so that's where the number comes from. So if you have 13 repeats at one area on the DNA molecule, then your allele is a 13.
Thank you. Now, in this particular case, I mean, you received a number of items that you tested, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you specifically about one individually. Did you receive a swab, an item identified as a swab of the grip, handle, and trigger of a Ruger 9mm pistol?
Yes, I did.
And approach the witness, Your Honor. showing you what's been entered into evidence as State's Exhibit 14. And can you tell me if you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And what is it?
It is a swab of a grip/handle of the trigger of Ruger.
Did you conduct DNA testing on this item?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us what were your results with regard to the swab of the pistol grip?
From this item, I obtained a partial DNA profile, and it matched the DNA profile that I obtained from the known standard of James Colley.
Okay. You said a partial DNA profile. Does that mean that you did not find genetic information at all 15 of those genetic markers?
I did obtain information at all 15 markers, but I only obtained a single allele at 5 of the markers. So going back to talking about inheriting half from your mom, half from your dad, so you have the one number of repeats from your mom and the one number of repeats from your dad. So 2 numbers make up your DNA profile. So 5 of the areas I only obtained 1 allele or 1 number. But I did still obtain information at all 15 areas in the gender marker.
And when you obtained those results with regard to the swab of the grip handle of the 9mm pistol, did you compare that to the complete DNA standard that you obtained from the buccal swab from James Colley?
Yes, I did.
And what were your conclusions based on that comparison?
It was a match. So when there's a match, I calculate a frequency or a statistic. And per my calculation, it was determined that within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the source of the DNA profile from my exhibit 34 and 29 are the DNA profile is from the same donor.
So the DNA that you obtained or you analyzed from the swab of the gun matched that of James Colley, is that correct?
That's correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any cross-examination?
I don't have anything, Your Honor.
Ms. Martin excused? She can't be. Yes, sir. Thank you, Ms. Martin.
Thank you.
Excused. Have a good day.
You too.
State, you can call your next witness.
State calls Thomas Colley.
Before we get after him, you'll take the witness stand right over here. Remain standing when you get there. Raise your right hand, please.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Take a seat. Mr. Johnson, you may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Could you introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, my name is Thomas Colley. Last name is P-O-L-E-Y.
Thank you, sir. How are you employed, sir?
I'm currently employed by the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
And what are your duties with the Sheriff's Office?
My duties with the Sheriff's Office are to examine fired cartridge cases, shell casings, if you will, and enter them into the ballistic database.
All right. How long have you worked for JSO?
About 6 months now.
And how were you employed prior to working with them?
Prior to that, I was employed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in Jacksonville.
And what were your duties with the FDLE?
I was an analyst in the Firearms Identification Section of the laboratory. My basic duties were to examine fired ammunition funds, bullets, cartridge cases, shot shells, to determine whether or not they were fired by a particular firearm. And with no doubt was submitted to try and determine if more than one firearm was involved, try and determine what type of firearm was involved. Also examine the firearms themselves to determine if they were in proper operating condition, and did some other examinations as far as like the restoration of military serial numbers and examination of items for the presence of gunshot residues.
How long did you work for FDLE doing that?
Doing that for about 28 years.
All right. And how long total did you work for FDLE?
34.
Can you briefly describe your education training as it relates to this field?
Yeah, somewhat briefly, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the College of Charleston, South Carolina. Once I was accepted for the position in firearms identification, I went to and completed the department's 2-year training program in the discipline of firearms identification, which was supervised by an experienced firearms examiner.
And I know you've been doing this for a long time. Is there any way for you to approximate or estimate how many times you've performed forensic analysis on firearms, firearms-related items, such as you described?
No, sir. Thousands.
Are you a member of any professional associations?
Yes, sir. I'm a member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners.
Have you trained other individuals in this particular area?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever testified before as an expert in firearms analysis?
Yes, I have.
And approximately how many times?
About 275 times.
Mr. Colley, were you working for FDLE specifically in April and May of 2016?
Yes, sir.
And during that time, were you assigned to conduct analysis of several items of evidence in connection with a death investigation being conducted by the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office that occurred on August the 27th of 2015?
Yes, sir.
And how many submissions of evidence did you receive in the case?
I believe it was 2. No, take it back, it was just 1.
Okay. And approximately how many items of evidence did you receive?
About 28.
Did any of those items include firearms?
Yes, sir.
And how many firearms did you receive?
2.
And what type of firearms did you receive?
They were both semi-automatic pistols. One was 9mm caliber, and the other one was 45 caliber.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm showing you right now what's been entered into evidence. This states Exhibit 52. Take a look at that, and you can open that box if you need to.
Yes, sir.
You can take a look at that and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, sir, I did.
And what do you recognize it to be?
This is the 45 caliber pistol that I examined.
And how do you recognize it to be the 45 caliber gun you examined?
At the time of my examination, on the box itself, I wrote our laboratory case number, the exhibit number, and my initials. On the gun, I placed the same information, and then I put a tag on the pistol as well with the case number, the exhibit number, and my initials.
All right, now showing you Exhibit 13. You can take a look at that and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, sir, I do.
And what is it?
This is the 9mm pistol that I examined.
And what brand is it?
This is this pistol was made by a company called Ruger, R-U-G-E-R.
And the 45, and I can let you see it again if you need to. I don't think I asked you what brand or maker was the 45 caliber handgun.
Smith & Wesson.
Did you also receive various cartridge cases, projectiles, fragments of projectiles, also to examine?
Yes, sir.
And we'll just kind of do this in segments here because we've got several items. You can just take a look at each of these and tell me if these are the items that you examined. I'm showing you exhibit number 15.
Yes, sir, I recognize all of them.
Okay. And just kind of in general, what are we have some fire cartridge cases as well as projectiles, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now I'm showing you State's Exhibit 16.
Yes, sir, I recognize them.
And these are also items that you analyzed?
Yes, they are.
State's Exhibit 30. Take a look at that.
Yes, sir, I recognize it.
Okay. You conducted analysis on these items?
Yes, I did.
State's Exhibit 29.
Yes, sir, I recognize those as well.
Okay. And what do we have here on this exhibit?
On this exhibit, there are two fire projectiles and some fragments of projectile.
State's Exhibit 11.
Okay, for State's Exhibit 11, there's an intact cartridge that has not been fired. I did not examine that item. And then there's a fired shell casing that I did examine.
Okay, and that's on the right-hand side of Exhibit 11?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. And State's Exhibit 18.
Okay, so for State's Exhibit 18, all but one of the items on the board I did examine. There's a small box with looks like to be some projectile fragments that I did not examine that.
Okay. And what about the one here on that's kind of labeled item 70 on the bottom left-hand side?
That's a fired projectile.
Okay, did you examine that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And over here on the right-hand side, you see a piece of wood that looks like something's been dug out of it. Do you recognize that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and is there also a item of evidence related to that?
There's also a projectile that I removed from that section of wood. Yes, sir.
So this projectile, you actually were the one that dug it out of the wood to analyze it?
Yes, sir.
Now, with regard to the Ruger 9mm, were you able to determine what was the maximum capacity of that Ruger 9mm in terms of how many bullets could you put in the magazine plus the chamber?
Well, the magazine holds 10. The maximum capacity of the firearm would be 11. You could have one chamber and recircle fully loaded magazine for a total of 11 cartridges.
Okay, and what about the Smith & Wesson 45?
I believe the magazine on that one has a capacity of 8 cartridges, so with one addition in the chamber, it would be 9.
Okay. Now, what were you asked to do with regard to the 2 firearms that you received, as well as the various cartridge cases, the projectiles, the fragments, the other items that you received?
I was asked to, obviously examine all of them, the fired cartridge cases and projectiles, to determine how many guns were represented between those items. and then to compare them, if necessary, to the 2 pistols that have been submitted.
Okay. How many cartridge cases, and let me stop there and ask you, when we refer to a cartridge case, what exactly does that mean?
Again, the more common term is probably casing or shell casing. It's what's left over from an intact cartridge after it's been expended, after the projectile is shot out, the powder is burned, you're left with a cartridge case and a primer in the center of the cartridge, base of the cartridge case.
Okay. And what happens to a cartridge case after the gun has been fired? What generally happens with a cartridge case?
Well, in an auto-loading firearm, such as these 2 pistols, the cartridge case has to be extracted and ejected from the pistol for another cartridge to load in to the chamber before it's fired again. So as part of the normal process of firing, the cartridge case gets ejected from the gun.
How many of these cartridge cases, or what we might refer to as a fire shell casing, how many of those did you receive for analysis?
I believe it was 11.
And all of those had been fired from a firearm, correct?
Yes, sir.
With regard to those 11 cartridge cases, were you able to determine the make and caliber of those cartridge cases?
Yes, sir.
And how were you able to do that?
That's relatively easy. Usually on the base or the head of the cartridge case, there's a manufacturer's name or symbol, and then the caliber of the cartridge case itself.
Okay. And with regard to the 11, were there some of those cartridge cases of 1 caliber versus another caliber?
Yes, sir. I believe 5 of them were 45 caliber, and the remaining 6 were 9mm.
Now, you said you also received several projectiles for analysis as well. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And how many of those did you receive?
12, I believe it was.
Now, when we refer to a projectile, generally a layperson, what do they generally understand that to mean?
A bullet.
Okay. And this is the part of that's attached to the shell casing that's expelled through the firearm?
That's correct.
And you said you received 12 of those?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and one of those was in the embedded in the wood, is that correct?
That's right.
How many of those bullets had evidence of having been fired from the firearm?
All of them.
Were you able to determine anything about those projectiles, either their makeup or the caliber, prior to comparing them to any of the firearms you received?
Their makeup and the caliber of each of the projectiles and the characteristics of the gun that they were fired from.
Okay. And how were you able to determine the caliber as well?
Yes, sir.
And how many of those were, what caliber of those of the bullets, what caliber were they?
Let's see, 4 of them were 45. I'm sorry, 5 of them were 45 caliber, and 7 were 9mm caliber.
Now, you also received some fragments, you indicated, correct?
Yes, sir.
And can you kind of describe some of those fragments that you received?
Most of the fragments were very small, and they were either pieces of the outer portion, the jacket of the projectile, or the inner portion, a lead piece of lead of the projectile. And in one instance, it was looked like the plastic or polymer tip of one of the projectiles.
Okay. And do you recall what color that was?
I believe it was a light green.
Were you able to do any, make any determination with regard to any of the fragments?
No, there were no rifling impressions on any of those fragments, so really wasn't able to do anything as far as identifying them back to one of the firearms that I received, or to tell what caliber or anything else about the projectile that they were fragment of.
With regard to the cartridge cases and the projectiles, were they of value for the purposes of identifying them as having been fired from a specific firearm?
Yes, sir.
Now, before we kind of get into that, to your results, can you kind of briefly describe what you do, both with regard to a shell casing as well as a projectile, kind of the process that you go through to kind of determine whether it matches a particular firearm?
During my examination process, and they're similar for both the cartridge cases and for the projectiles, is to examine those items first, like I've been saying, to see how many guns are involved. To look at characteristics on each of those, to see if they're all the same, and see if they're similar to any firearms that I might have received. A lot of this is done through a comparison microscope that allows me to view both items in the same field of view simultaneously at the same magnification. Based on my examination in this case, all the 45s had similar characteristics, all the 9mm had similar characteristics, and those characteristics ended up being similar to bullets and cartridge cases that I fired from the two pistols that I received. So there's indications of 145, 9mm in all the ammunition components, cartridge cases and projectiles. They're also consistent with the two guns that I received. At that point, then I tested the two guns, got known examples of cartridge cases and bullets from those two firearms, and I compared those to the examples that I had in evidence. I did that comparison to see if they were fired by those two particular firearms.
Okay. So of the 9mm shell casings that you received, you were able to determine that all of those had been fired from the same firearm. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And with regard to the shell casings from the 45 shell casings that you had received, you determined that all of those had been fired from the same firearm, correct?
Well, for those, they weren't marked that well. They were all very similar,
Okay.
but they weren't marked well enough to say definitively that they were fired in one gun.
I see. Okay. And then in order to compare those to the gun, the firearms that you received themselves, what did you do in order to make that comparison?
Well, in the laboratory at FDLA, there's a small indoor range that we have, that they have, and with a water recovery tank. So I fire the gun into the tank, I can recover the projectiles. Projectiles get fired into the tank, I recover them in the water. The cartridge cases are ejected as part of the normal process of firing, and I collect those. So I have known examples from a particular firearm. I examine those microscopically just like I did the cartridge cases and projectiles recovered from the microscope.
Okay. And just to kind of walk through this, following your analysis on all the items of evidence you received, were you able to determine that any of the cartridge cases were fired from the Ruger 9mm pistol that you also received?
Yes, sir.
And how many of those cartridge cases were you able to determine had been fired from that 9mm pistol?
As I believe I said before, I think there were 6 9mm cartridge cases. I was able to identify all 6 to the Ruger pistol.
And with regard to the fired projectiles, how many of those were you able to determine had been fired from the Ruger 9mm pistol?
7.
Out of the, and you originally, I think you said you had received how many of those? 11, is that correct? Or 12 of those projectiles? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. 12.
Okay. Out of the remaining, how many? What were you able to determine following your analysis?
So there were 5 remaining projectiles. They were 45 caliber, and I was able to identify those 5 projectiles to the Smith & Wesson pistol.
The cartridge cases that you were not able to conclusively identify as having been fired from the 45, how many of the, what were you able to determine as a result of your analysis?
They were all, they weren't very well marked. But, so I wasn't able to identify them either to each other as saying they were all definitively fired from one gun, nor was I able to say they were definitely fired from the Smith & Wesson 45 caliber pistol. There were similarities between the two, but the markings weren't sufficient to determine conclusively they were fired in that particular gun.
So just to kind of recap, you were able to conclude that all 6 of the Luger caliber 9mm cartridge cases and 7 of the bullets received were fired from the Ruger 9mm handgun. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're able to conclude that the 5 remaining cartridges you received were some individual characteristics to the Smith & Wesson .45 caliber working gun, and conclusively determined that the remaining 4 bullets you received were in fact fired from the Smith & Wesson .45. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You bet. Cross-examination.
Just quickly, Your Honor. As far as the 9mm, you said that you shot it and the cartridge was ejected.
Yes, sir.
Which way does it eject?
For that pistol, and actually for the .45 as well, generally ejects to the right, and anywhere from a little bit forward to a little bit back, depending on the particular firearm. But the ejection port, where the cartridge case comes out on the pistol, is on the right-hand side, and so that's the direction, the general direction in which they're ejecting.
And approximately how far will it shoot it out?
I didn't observe that or note that at the time that I did the examination. It's not part of the normal process either for examination. But generally, it depends on the cartridge. Sometimes the make, how much, some cartridges have a little bit more pressure than others. They tend to eject a little bit farther. But generally, somewhere between like 3 to 8 feet. It's been my experience.
1 second here. We have nothing else, Your Honor.
Any redirect? No, Your Honor. Mr. Colley, excused? Thank you. Mr. Colley, you are excused. State, call your next witness.
Your Honor, at this time, the state rests.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the state has rested its case. That means that's all the evidence and testimony you're going to hear in the state's case in chief. I do need to meet with the lawyers in a while at this point to discuss a variety of things, including the instructions that I'm going to give you. That's going to take a couple of hours. So rather than keeping you around for a couple of hours and then starting a witness at 4 o'clock, if there are any, I'm going to go ahead and excuse you for the day. So it's going to be an early, very early day today. I would ask that you be back tomorrow at 8:45, ready to go. And again, in that jury room where you start this morning. Again, please don't read, listen to, or watch any news accounts of this case overnight. I'll ask you that same question in the morning. I've been asking you every morning. Please don't do any research of any type. Don't discuss this case with anybody. Again, leave your notes here in the courtroom. They'll be secured overnight, and they'll be back in your seats when you get back in the morning. And we'll get back in the morning. We'll be ready to go at that point. So I wish everybody a good day. Let's say good evening, good far from me. I wish you a good day. We'll see y'all tomorrow morning. Everybody else, thank you. Y'all can be seated. Take just a moment till we get the jury cleared out of the hall before we start addressing some of the things we need to talk about.
Have them in my head, I guess. As to count 3, the attempted first-degree murder of Lamar Dauberly. Your Honor, Mr. Dauberly never identified Mr. Colley as the person who was shooting. In fact, I believe his exact testimony was he never saw him, never laid eyes on him before, and he never saw who was shooting. So I'd say that they failed to identify Mr. Colley on that count. As to counts 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, I would also move for judgment and acquittal on those as to the fact that Ms. Hendricks failed to identify Mr. Colley. When asked to identify Mr. Colley by an article of clothing that he was wearing, she turned her head, looked down, and said he's sitting over there. Never looked at him, never identified him, never said what he was wearing. There were 4 people sitting at the chair. It could have been any 4 of those. As to the rest of the counts, Your Honor, or all the counts together, I would say that the state's failed to prove a prima facie case that would allow this to go to the jury, and looking at all the evidence like most favorable to the moving party, I'd ask the enter judgment of acquittal.
Judge, I thought it was pretty clear, both from Ms. Hendricks' testimony and the testimony in its totality, that Mr. Colley was in fact identified as the person who killed Amanda Colley, killed Wendy Dobbins, and then attempted to kill Rachel Hendricks as well as Lamar Dauberly. I think he actually asked the court to make the record reflect that the witness has identified. The court so noted that for the record. And in terms of the prima facie evidence argument, Judge, the evidence is plethora as to each of the has to be viewed in the light most favorable to the state as to whether or not the jury has sufficient information to actually make a decision. In this particular case, Judge, we spent the last 2.5 days presenting that evidence, and we would rely, of course, on the courts being able to sitting here and listening to all that evidence and seeing the evidence, and we would argue that that this is a matter that's best left to the jury.
The only specific arguments in support of the motion for judgment of acquittal by the defense were made with respect to counts 3 and 4. With respect to count 3, the attempted first-degree murder charge with Lamar Deverly as the victim. The evidence has established, prima facie evidence has established the defendant was a person firing firearms at that location, at that date and time. After the defendant entered the residence, there were comments made, where is he, where is he? The only male present at the time was Mr. Deverly, so there has been a prima facie case made of attempted first-degree murder as to Mr. Deverly. As to the attempted murder of Ms. Hendricks, alleged in count 4 of the indictment, Ms. Hendricks did identify the defendant in the courtroom. She had prior experience with the defendant, so this wasn't somebody she had only seen one time in her life. So she made an adequate identification in the courtroom, and the court noted that for the record. So there has been a prima facie case with regards to count 4. With regards to the other counts, to which there was less argument, the state has made a prima facie case for the charges in the remaining counts of the indictment. So the motion for judgment of acquittal as to all counts will be denied. All right, so is the defense still intending to put forward a case tomorrow?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, you said about 5 witnesses, is that what you said?
Yes, between probably 4 and 6.
And how long do you think that's going to take?
I can see this being done early afternoon at the latest.
Okay. Has there been a decision made yet as to whether or not the defendant is going to testify in this case?
We're still discussing that, Your Honor.
So we can address that in the morning?
Yes,
Will
sir.
there be a decision in the morning?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And has the defense still, or is the defense still taking the position that it is abandoning the involuntary intoxication defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. So, Mr. Colley, let me ask you a couple of questions. I placed you under oath a few days ago. I asked you some questions this morning, whether you were under the influence of any drugs, alcohol, narcotics, or medication. You answered negatively. You also answered negatively as to whether you suffer from any mental illness, and you indicated you understood everything going on here today. So let me go over some of these things with you again. It's a bit repetitive from this morning, but your lawyers have indicated a desire to waive or no longer pursue the involuntary intoxication defense. Is that your decision as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you understand that that issue will be waived forever? So in the event you are convicted and you challenge your conviction somewhere down the line and you allege that your lawyers were ineffective for not pursuing an involuntary intoxication defense, do you understand you will not be able to pursue that issue?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And have you had ample time to discuss that issue with your lawyers, including the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of waiving or not pursuing that involuntary intoxication defense?
Yes, sir.
And do you need any additional time to discuss this with your lawyers?
No, Your Honor.
And are you in agreement with your lawyer's decision to not pursue that defense?
Yes, sir.
And is that your decision as well?
Yes, sir.
All right. Your lawyers have also indicated to me a desire to put on a defense, in this case, some lay witnesses, 4 or 5 lay witnesses. Do you understand that the defense is not obligated to put on anything, any evidence, and it's the state's obligation to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Are you in agreement with your lawyer's decisions to call some witnesses to testify in your defense tomorrow?
Yes, sir.
And have you had enough time to discuss all of that with your lawyers?
We have some fine tuning to do, but yes, sir.
Okay. And is it your decision as well to put forward a defense in this case through some witnesses tomorrow?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay. We'll find that the defendant has freely, voluntarily, and intelligently made the decision to no longer pursue the involuntary intoxication defense, as well as put on evidence and testimony in this case. He is competent, coherent, and alert, and did fully understand his right to put on that defense if he desired, and to not put on any defense or any witnesses if he desired as well. Mr.
Colley, also in the morning, I'm going to be asking you whether you desire to testify in this case or not. Let me cover that with you briefly. You don't have to answer anything at this point because I want you to talk with your lawyers overnight on that. You have the absolute right to not testify in this case. If you choose to not testify in this case, I would give the jury an instruction that they cannot consider that against you. They can't draw any inferences about that, and you've exercised a fundamental constitutional right in doing so. You also have the right to testify in this case if you desire. If you choose to testify, you would be subject to cross-examination, as have all the other witnesses in this trial. The state would have an opportunity to ask you questions on cross-examination, any questions that are permissible under the Florida Evidence Code. Do you understand that?
I do, Your Honor.
And do you understand that it is your decision and your decision alone, obviously after consulting with your lawyers, but it is your decision and your decision alone as to whether you desire to testify or not testify?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we'll give you some opportunity to discuss all that with your lawyers this evening. Let's talk about jury instructions. Do y'all need a few minutes, a break or anything before we move to senior to state? Yes. So let's go ahead and take a short recess. Let's take 10 minutes and have your jury instructions ready to go, and then we'll talk about that.